everyone. My name is Henry Hale. I'm professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University, and am very honored, I would say, to chair this session devoted to the launch of my colleague's new book. I'm talking, of course, about Dr. Marlene Laruelle, who is a director of our Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at GW, and one of the foremost experts on Russian Eurasian politics, particularly as it pertains to ideologies and the role of ideas and the intersections with authoritarian and other forms of politics. The title of her book, which is just out from Cornell University Press, is Russia Fascist? Unraveling Propaganda East and West. And so I think there's no better way to celebrate the appearance of a book than to invite a number of other leading experts to join in a discussion of it. So we are very happy that we are joined today by some of the top scholars in related fields. I'll briefly introduce them now, and then when we come to them, I will also repeat some of that information. But basically, Marlene will talk for about 10 minutes to introduce the main ideas of the book. Then the discussants will each take about 10 minutes to give their perspective on it. And then we'll return back to Marlene for her response before opening it up. The discussants include Paul Good, who is Associate Professor and Macmillan Chair of Russian Studies at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. He's also Editor-in-Chief of Communist and Post-Communist Studies, the journal, and Associate Editor of the journal Nationalities papers. Yoshiko Herrera will speak next as discussant. She is Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, former Director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia there, as well as former Co-Director of the Institute for Regional and International Studies. And the third discussant today is Anton Shekhovtsov, who is Director of the Center for Democratic Integrity in Austria and Associate Research Fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. He's also editor of the Explorations of the Far Right book series at the publisher Ibidem Verlag, and a member of the editorial board of Fascism, Journal of Comparative Fascist Studies. So I think this should be a really excellent discussion, and we're really grateful for everybody, we're thankful to everybody for joining us today. Just before turning things over to Marlene, just a word about procedure, which is we'll take questions through the chat function. So if you could send me or the host your questions, I will try to aggregate them and pose them once we reach that phase of the discussion. And so I should also note that this event is organized by IRES, our Institute for European, Russian, Asian Studies, as well as the Elliott School of International Affairs at GW, of which it is a part, and Ponar's Eurasia. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Marlene to get us started.
Thank you so much, Henry. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. So very briefly, I wanted to present the main arguments, the main points that I'm developing in the books. And so with these books, I wanted to, in fact, answer two main questions. The first one is why this mutual accusation of fascism around Russia have been growing all this last year. And by that, I mean both Russia being accused of being fascist, but also Russia accusing other countries of being fascist. And the second question is, does this label help us in one way or another to interpret what is happening in Russia? So the answer to the first question is in fact to be found in two different contexts, a global and a regional one. The global context, I think, is the rise of illiberal or populist movements that are disrupting the established consensus around liberal democracy. And so, of course, labeling an illiberal or populist leader fascist help us, in a sense, avoiding the difficult discussion of why liberal democracy is weakening or why liberal democracy can be challenged. But I also think that this inflation in labels and insults, it's also the result of the ideological fluidity in which we live. And this ideological fluidity is creating insecurity. And one way to avoid this insecurity is to bring back on the table old-style doctrinal boxes that are very easy to fill out. And of course, in that context, the notion of fascism offers a very easy and powerful dichotomy between those who would be the good guys and those who would be the bad guys. The regional context is that of the memory war around interpreting the Second World War. And so the key question is, who were the fascists? Was that the Soviet Union that signed the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, or was that the Central European countries which collaborated with Nazi Germany, sometimes against the Soviet Union? But I think the goal of this memory war is not so much to interpret the past, it's to kind of figure point who are the new fascists today. So for Russia, it's the Central European countries which challenge the narrative of the Soviet victories of 1945 and tend to rehabilitate their collaborationist movement as freedom fighters. For the Central European and for some in the West, for the Central European countries and for some in the West, it is the Putin's regime who is fascist. And it's what I call Snyder triangular argument, which is based on, so Putin would be a kind of neo-Stalinist figure, Stalinism would equate Nazism, therefore Putin is like Hitler. But in fact, the key point of this, the key struggle around this definition of who is fascist is to define what is the future of Europe, who belongs to it, who is legitimate to tell us what Europe should be, and where Europe finishes on its eastern side. And so you have two confronting narratives, the Central European countries that promote a vision of Europe that is strongly transatlantic and exclude Russia as the main kind of antinomy of European or Western values, or the Russian side that invites Russia to dissociate itself more from the US, to be more continental, and to integrate Russia into a kind of European security architecture. And so what the book is trying to do is to analyze this mutual accusation of fascism as a mirror game, and also as a strategic narrative that has huge policy consequences depending on which side you think is more or less right. And it's also in this context that I'm looking at the accusation of Russia being an imperialistic power around the Crimea annexation. And I think, in fact, it's telling much more about the shared difficulties of the West or Europe to find a common language with Russia, and of Russia to manage its post-colonial identity, that it would be a feature of fascism. On the second question, does this label help us in any way or to interpret what is happening in Russia? I answer by the negative in saying that no, Russia is not fascist and the terminology is not very helpful. And of course, it's very challenging to do a demonstration by the negative, right? So you may wonder what it was to write a book if the answer is no. And I think it was important, both scholarly and in terms of policy implication, to challenge the three main argument that is usually put forward to justify the supposed fascism of Russia. The first one is that the Russian regime would have a fascist ideology. The second one is that Russia has far-right groups. And the third one is that Russia is supporting the far-right in Europe. So I will be very briefly explaining what are my main take on these three questions. On the one of the Russian regime having a fascist ideology, of course, it depends on how you define fascism, and those who are kind of accusing Russia of being fascist, being Snyder, Alexander Motil, Vladislav Inozemtsev, they have each of them different ways of defining what is fascist. But if we take the main kind of consensual definition of fascism, I'm replaying that, well, Russia doesn't have any coherent ideology. It has different ecosystems that compete with each other. It still has a large ideological plurality and fluidity, and that doesn't fit the conventional vision of fascism as a kind of all-encompassing totalitarian ideology. Then the Russian regime is not trying to indoctrinate the population with a very clear built doctrine, and society is in fact quite resilient to any attempt at indoctrination. So he also doesn't fit the image of fascism as an indoctrinating ideology. The regime doesn't have any mass mobilization mechanism. On the contrary, it pushes the population for depolitization and demobilization. It doesn't have a utopian regeneration myth that would say that only war can cleanse the society and regenerate here. So here also I fit the Russian regime I consider the Russian regime doesn't fit the usual definition. And I don't consider the Russian regime as ultra-nationalist. I consider the regime is still fighting against ethno-nationalism and continue to defend multi-ethnicity and the multi-confessional nature of Russia. So you can reply to me that the Kremlin is promoting some ethnic element in the nation building process, and I agree. But I think what he's telling us that the Kremlin is seeing Russia as a unitary state and not as a federation. And therefore, he wants a kind of centralized mythology for nationhood purposes. But I'm not considering that as any feature related to fascism. And then, yes, the Russian regime is promoting conservative or traditional value. It is illiberal, depending on the definition you want to have. It has authoritarian feature that make it not nice to people who share liberal values, but that doesn't make it a fascist. So what is the room for fascism in this kind of broad overview? Well, everything that is related to historic fascism in the sense of related to Nazi Germany is more or less forbidden now in Russia. So the only realm of idea that can exist is what I call national parafascism. That is doctrine that have some of their elements that can be considered as fascist, and that have to be rooted in Russian cultural feature to be accepted. And I more or less three of them: Revisionism, Black Hundred, and what we can call national Bolshevism. These three kind of ideology have their own niche. They have some patrons inside the military-industrial complex or the Orthodox Church, and they are authorized to speak as part of a larger kind of nationalist or conservative ideological framework. But they are only one small part of a broader ideological offer, and they are not dominating the spectrum of what the Kremlin is promoting to its own population. More briefly, the second argument on Russia as some far-right group, where there are far-right groups everywhere in Europe and in the US. And I think the one we have in Russia has been kind of overemphasized. When you look in detail and you try to compare, for example, with the US, you can see they are less developed in terms of organizational structure. They have less popular support. It's difficult to identify their constituencies if you compare with the US. Yes, they are connected to law enforcement agencies, but in the US, in Germany, in France, the European far-right groups are also very often connected to by different ways to law enforcement agencies. So I see that it's a worrisome trend, but it's not enough to qualify the regime of fascist, and it has nothing specific to Russia. The last accusation is that Russia supports far-right in Europe. And I think that's a key element in decredibilizing Russia's claim to be a responsible stakeholder in European affairs. But that also, I think, doesn't qualify Russia for being fascist for several reasons. The first one, and that the key one, is that this illiberal populist movement in Europe are not born because of Russia. Russia is not responsible for their emergence and their popular support. Russia is only a kind of amplifying chamber for them. Then we tend to be obsessed with this kind of Russia support to the far right. But when you look at Russia outreach to Europe, it's much more complicated than that. It has a lot of kind of more classic public diplomacy tool. It has economic lobbyism. It can speak to different constituencies. It can speak to the left, to the one nostalgic from the Soviet Union. It can speak to, in the Middle East and Africa, to anti-colonial audience. So Russia is playing with a very kind of broad, postmodern, eclectic ideological repertoire in which the far right is only one element against another one. And the last point I wanted to make is that in the book, I try to explain that the only feature where I think Russia is fitting the conventional definition of fascism, it fits cult of the paramilitary that has this kind of fascist body aesthetic. But here also, I think it's not as developed or as in the US. And I'm asking the question is that how many features of fascism should you have to qualify the regime of fascism? And I think if Russia has only this element that I identified as fitting the definition, it's not enough to qualify the regime of fascism. So in conclusion, three key points is that the book is showing that first, the inflation of the accusation of fascism is in fact deployed, discuss the future of Europe and the inclusion or exclusion of Russia in it. The second conclusion is that some fascist feature may exist as one segment of a large plurality of other ideological elements. And in that case, I don't think that a country or regime should qualify for the term of fascism. And then even more, I think fascism exists in a democratic environment. You have in every society groups of population or narrative that can be identified as fascist and who work in tension with liberal democratic and leftist ideology. We have them in the US. That doesn't make us saying the US is a fascist country. And the last point is that I think it's important that we stop seeing Russia as the kind of absolute other whose values would be really kind of ontologically opposed to ours. I think on the contrary, Russia is part of a continuum with our own so-called Western liberal democracy, and that we share much more, we share problems, we share interaction, we share transformation, we share this kind of ideological fluidity, and that would be much more constructive to accept, to analyze this continuum than to work on this kind of black and white dichotomy as the proponent of Russia fascism are trying to sell us. And I will stop here. I already spent more than 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Marlene. So let's turn first to Paul Good, who is Associate Professor and Macmillan Chair of Russian Studies at the Institute for European Russian Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. Please, Paul, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. This is a real privilege to be part of this panel discussion. This book is highly recommended. It is meticulously researched and but written in a very accessible fashion, and it's been a real honor to see how it has evolved up to this point. And it serves a very important purpose. And I think that there is, an important pushback against the popular discourse about Russia as a fascist state, and it does an exceptional job at doing so, and shining a light on the extent to which fascism has become a field of discourse, not just with regards to Russia, but also in a comparative sense. And I think it serves an important function, and it does a service to the field in that regard. Now, looking at fascism as a kind of discourse, as a process of myth-making, in effect, what she is looking at, what Laruelle is looking at in this book is fascism and anti-fascism, really, as a form of legitimation. Not just in terms of domestic politics, but also in terms of international politics. And I think the distinction between fascism, illiberalism, and nationalism is also particularly useful and should be good, I think, food for thought. So as an intellectual undertaking, this is a fascinating work and is also extremely useful in terms of the empirical analysis, which is, as always, immaculately presented. So with any important work, there are, of course, some loose ends. And in this case, I think that these are constructive loose ends, insofar as they push us to identify weaknesses in our understanding of the importance of informal power relations, especially in the diffusion of illiberal and nationalist practices, particularly in non-democracies, but not exclusively so. So in my remaining time, I want to focus on just a few of these loose ends, and not really to highlight the book's weaknesses, because I don't want to criticize Marlene for the book that she didn't write, but rather to suggest that the book's work has ample room for expansion. Now, first, for all of the empirical detail, there's not a lot of sense of how Putin's regime actually works, especially in relation to the pervasively informal forms of power competition that occur within Russia. For instance, in acknowledging the diversity of grassroots groups with high-placed patrons, Laruelle notes that such groups are provided, in effect, krysha and competitive advantages. And as she observes, state actors may be interested in supporting these groups for a variety of reasons: personal friendships, paramilitary dreams of the future, or influencing other groups for that matter. But there is also an additional, factor, and applying Occam's razor here, perhaps the most straightforward explanation is that these groups don't randomly rise or fall. They do compete with one another in varieties of nationalist and illiberal outbidding, and oftentimes this is in response to signals, which are usually ambiguous, that are provided by the Kremlin or by the presidential administration. That's how I use that term. And so in this sense, it would be useful to connect these informal signals with the ways that these groups rise and fall, rather than looking for the Kremlin to straight out say, okay, we're recruiting fascists and nationalists, so who wants to sign up? Because that's unlikely to happen. Now, second, one gets the sense that for Russia to be called fascist, Russians must first be willing to call themselves fascist. In the study of nationalism, there is a similar tension around whether those who do not call themselves nationalist might be considered as such. Now, I would say a kind of tension along these same lines emerge in the description of Putin's regime in this book, in which there are competing ideological tensions, competing ideological ecosystems that do events occasional or, on the margins, some fascist inclinations. But ultimately, these are kept in check by management, by the presidential administration. So as is pointed out, say, in Chapter 8, the government does not advance a doctrine of ethnic superiority, even though there have been attempts at the federal level to institutionalize the idea that ethnic Russians are the cornerstone of Russian sovereignty. Added to this, Putin openly denounces nationalism, even though nationalism as a term is understood in Russia as meaning extremism. And so it's not surprising in the sense that Putin would denounce extremism. If ethnic minorities' rights are diminishing, this isn't necessarily because of ethnic chauvinism, but more as a consequence of the centralization of power. And if Putin uses the term Ruski more than Rossiyski after 2014 when explaining support for the annexation of Crimea, and to deny that Ukrainian independent statehood is legitimate, at least he is using it in a civilizational sense rather than an ethnic sense. And Russia's wars in Georgia and Ukraine were protectionist because they are symptomatic of a post-colonial attachment rather than a denial of their right of independent states to choose their own security partnerships. In other words, what we have here is, yes, there is not an outright doctrine of ethnic superiority, but there are a broad range of consequences of informal practices and formal policies that potentially move Russia towards or closer to an ethno-nationalist orbit, regardless of what the regime's intentions might be. And I think that's something that seems to be present when you start stacking up the number of reasons why Russia is not, a nationalist state, and you end up still in a nationalist place. And so this is another sort of way I think that we need to think about how we can account for the accumulation of these informal practices as well as policies. Finally, I would just point out that there is surprisingly little discussion of patriotism as a legitimating frame and its relationship to nationalism in Putin's Russia. Now, I counted just 12 mentions of the term patriotism in the book. Yet if we want to talk about official legitimating doctrines, this can't really be avoided anymore in today's Russia. The meaning of patriotism is largely equated in the book with a discursive strategy that is intended to disqualify liberals from participation in public politics and debate. It also features as a component of militia cultures that are discussed towards the end of the book as one of Russia's genuinely fascist attributes. But as Michael Billig and other constructivists in nationalism studies have noted over the years, the conceptual boundaries between patriotism and nationalism can be pretty fuzzy. And it's commonly the case that one refers to one's allies as patriots, right, and your enemies as nationalists. So if we pry open the Soviet legacy for understandings of patriotism, there is a clear emphasis on loyalty to the state and a clear emphasis on preparedness to defend the motherland. And this obviously is linked very much to the memory of the Great Patriotic War. Manifesting now in contemporary times, for instance, in the rapid expansion of patriotic education, which includes also paramilitary training for school children. In the wake of 2014, patriotism became imbued with overtly ethnic meanings in such fashion that the meaning of being a patriot and being Russian became difficult for many to disentangle on a quotidian level, even if that was not the content of the official discourse. In other words, the everyday understandings of what the government's intents were with regards to patriotism were at variance with what the official doctrine was. And those everyday understandings interpreted patriotism in an ethno-national direction. Extraordinary resources have been invested in patriotism and allocated to patriotic grants since 2014. And just last year, an entire raft of patriotic amendments to the Russian Constitution made patriotism an unavoidable, institutionalized form of legitimation that is now fused with the discourse of anti-fascism. So in essence, to talk about Putin's adoption of Soviet-style patriotism with ethnic overtones is what I consider to be the 800-pound gorilla in the room, right? When we talk about whether Russia is becoming fascist, precisely because patriotism is now wielded by the state, not just to compel, but also to mobilize and to punish and to exclude. And because it is the discursive field within which competition for resources and status now occurs in Russian politics, it also potentially becomes the point of entry for ideological entrepreneurs to promote fringe and even neo-fascist sentiments. Now, again, none of this is really to suggest that this is, the necessary outcome. But I do think this is potentially where the logic of the argument leads us if we want to think about how does this evolve? And what do we make of these terms? If we're going to pry open terms like fascism, we also have to be ready to pry open terms like patriotism and nationalism, and illiberalism for that matter, right? And think about the ways that they potentially fit together when the formal policies and informal practices meet at the middle ground. So I will stop there and just to say once more that this is a fantastic book, and you should absolutely take a look at it. I certainly intend to be recommending chapters from this book in my classes this fall. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. So next we will hear from Yoshiko Herrera, who is professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So you can take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Henry. Thank you, Marlene Laruelle, for writing such a great book. I'm gonna try to restrict my comments to really talking about the regime and to the question of whether Russia is fascist. But before I get to that, I just want to point out that conceptually and as a model for conceptual analysis, I think the book actually serves a great purpose in not only helping us understand fascism, but just as a model for thinking about a concept and how we might apply that to a country. And not only does the book, first of all, go through the work of definitions of fascism and whether Russia fits, but really importantly, the book focuses on the uses of fascism, the uses of labeling a country fascist, the uses of saying you're not fascist. And I think that, as Marlene mentioned earlier, one of the functions that's interesting here is to keep Russia relevant in international and especially European affairs. But by understanding the functions of talking about fascism, it also provides a very good explanation for this somewhat obsessive focus on the past in World War II and redoing World War I even, et cetera. So, I mean, I think actually talking about the uses of fascism helps us understand one of the key historical foci of the Putin regime. And just in terms of contemporary discourse, I wanted to make a parallel, which is in discussions of racism. And I think it's an interesting, people call each other racist. They say, I'm not a racist. But I think similar to the book, it's useful to ask, what purpose does it serve to say, I'm not a racist, or to call someone racist? I think that's a very interesting thing to think about. When you're labeling people, what purpose is it serving in the conversation? So I think that's almost as valuable a contribution as the more traditional analysis of the concept and how it applies to Russia. Let me make a couple of points about, I really recommend the book to people who are interested in understanding Russian politics today, the regime today, as well as fascism. Let me say a couple of things about the regime. One of the contributions of the book is to talk about illiberalism. And illiberalism, not just as authoritarianism, but as a post-liberalism, let's say. That is, you had some level of liberalism, but, and this maybe gets to some of Paul's comments, that it returns to certain nationalist, nation first elements of promoting sovereignty, protectionism, rejecting multiculturalism to some extent. So I think that the liberalism as post-liberal rather than just authoritarian is actually an interesting concept in itself, and something that we can think of in not just in Russia, but in other supposed democracies or countries that are now being downgraded as democracy. I mean, it's an interesting way to think about what does it mean to be downgraded as democracy. In terms of the Putin regime, I think it's entirely correct that there isn't a coherent, the book makes this point, that there is not a coherent ideology. There is not the doctrinal coherence that many people aspire to the Putin regime. I think people who worked on the state in Russia, on the one hand, many people have vastly overestimated the coherence of the regime. And I think a good example of this is in the 2016 hacking of the US election debate. The idea that there's a well-ordered machine, that everybody is lined up and Putin just snaps his fingers and everything is able to be done systematically. I think that's just inaccurate. And I think the book portrays a much more accurate version of how the state works in terms of a sort of improvisational overlapping set of power structures. So the book talks about these ecosystems of the presidential administration, the military-industrial complex, and the Orthodox Church. And I think that's it's a good way to think about the regime, that it is definitely illiberal and it has some of those characteristics, but we shouldn't overestimate the coherence of the state generally under Putin. I also think that the book, this isn't the central focus, but the analysis of the Putin regime is quite consistent with current work on authoritarianism, even in regimes like China, that shows that regimes go to great lengths to get some level of popular support. And that can be through the strategic use of media, through assuring some level of economic growth or payments in a patronal way, but also the use of nationalism and the use of violence. And I think the use of violence is something that we're seeing increasingly in Russia. And so these might be areas that people can follow up on. But I think in terms of understanding the need for some level of popular support, I think the book is on target there. I want to also note, just like highlight another aspect that the book emphasizes, which is that Putinism is not a fixed category and that the regime has changed quite a lot in the 2000s. So I think that's just another way of understanding that the regime is not a single thing, and it is certainly not a coherent ideological machine. Just not to take up too much time, let me turn to the comments about I think a key question of the book, which is Russia fascist? And I just really appreciate the contribution of the book on this question, because it's timely, and it's not just writing a book to clarify the historical record. It's really contributing to current political debate. And let me just highlight 3 points from Professor Laruelle's argument here, which is, the first is that the historical parallels are wrong. Putin is neither Hitler nor Stalin. I think that cannot be overemphasized, and maybe our next speaker is going to discuss that in further detail. But it just seems to me you cannot gloss over Putin's lack of plans for world domination. I mean, that is a really important point. Yes, they took Crimea, but they do not have a plan to take over the rest of the world. And you also can't gloss over the lack of death camps or concentration camps or plans for genocide. I think that's also vitally important. I mean, it should seem obvious, but I think that just pointing out that the Putin regime is different from historical fascist regimes like Nazi Germany is really important point. I think another very interesting point is the lack of ideology in terms of totalitarianism or even Leninism, in terms of the social revolution, the modernization and tumult and just complete remaking of society is just not there. And one of the things that I think a lot of people who focus on Russia have noticed is that not only, as Marlene points out, not only is there no utopian vision, there's practically no plan whatsoever for the future. I mean, that's what is so striking, is it's so past focused. And I think one of the problems of the Putin regime that came out in 2011 very clearly with his return to the presidency is they have no plans at all for doing anything different. They just are they discuss stagnation. So I think the lack of a utopian vision and the lack of plans for the future, it's an important point about the Putin regime, and something also that keeps it from being a fascist regime. And then finally, I guess here, I think is really one of my only, I don't know if it's a disagreement, but I think it's a little bit of a place for debate, which is Russia, okay, I think it's a very helpful comment, let me say, first of all, that the book makes this distinction between ethno-nationalist, imperialist, and post-colonial regime. Okay, this is just very interesting way to think about Russia's place in world affairs. And is Russia an ethno-nationalist regime, imperialist, or post-colonial? And Marlene argues it's post-colonial. I think there is some question about imperialism in the near abroad. I think that when we think about Russia's relationship to the Baltic states, I think it's more solidly post-colonial. But I think in the relationship with Central Asia and with the Caucasus and possibly with Belarus, I don't know. I think it's worth thinking about, like, are we still in an imperial worldview? What is the extent to which Russia would go to protect its interests in those areas? And I'm not sure it's so solidly post-colonial. It could be, but I think actually in the near abroad is an interesting question. And I think it's also worth noting that Russia has not, since the end of the Soviet Union, used military force anywhere other than in the near abroad, with the exception of Syria. And that's why Syria is such an important case, is that that's the one place where Russia has actually used military force. So I will end it there, but I just want to recommend to everybody that's interested in Russian politics and in the question of fascism and in models of social science research for analyzing a concept to read this book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just before we turn on to the final discussant of Professor Laruelle's book, let me just remind people to pose their questions via the chat. So you can send them to me or the host, and they can be forwarded to me, or send them to everybody if you like. And then I will moderate the discussion, trying to group questions that might have similar themes. So with that reminder, let me now turn to Dr. Anton Cherhovtsov, who is director of the Center for Democratic Integrity and Associate Research Fellow at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs.
Thank you very much, Henry, for the introduction, and thank you for to the panel this very interesting discussion. And obviously, thank you very much, Marlene, for your new book, one of your numerous projects. I want to comment on what Marlene said about the cooperation or support even given by the Kremlin to the European or Western far right. I wrote the book on this topic, and I agree that sometimes this particular thesis, this argument that Russia is supporting in different ways European far right parties, sometimes this argument is taken as a justification to call Russia a fascist state. I myself, I don't subscribe to the idea that Russia is fascist. However, in my own works, I prefer calling still Russia as a right-wing authoritarian kleptocracy. Because in my opinion, it's definitely right-wing, although it does not have a coherent ideology. However, those ideas that it's promoting, it's advancing on the international level, but also on the domestic level, well, they are not left-wing and they are not centrist. They are clearly right-wing, despite the fact that probably we should not call the Russian society as really traditional or religious, because it's neither traditional as or nor conservative or religious. If you look at the number of abortions in Russia, if you look at the number of divorces, Putin himself is divorced. So pushing this traditionalist message, or saying that Russia is traditionalist, it would be incorrect. However, still, Russia is presenting itself as a traditionalist power, a power that is protecting religious values, family values. However, I would say that this is a right-wing message. However, it does not really correspond to the reality of the living reality of the Russian people. But back to this argument about the far right. Indeed, we see that over the years, and I would say, well, starting at least from 2012, 2013, we have seen Russia as a state, and Russian institutions, Russian officials, giving giving support for European far-right parties, mostly to the European far-right parties. We can talk about media support. We can talk about political support, and sometimes, in very rare cases, we see financial support. Let me first say something about media support. This is probably the most widespread form of support given to the far right by Kremlin-affiliated actors in Russia. We can talk about RT, we can talk about Sputnik, and before Sputnik, we could talk about this website, the Voice of Russia, that was essentially then Sputnik replaced the Voice of Russia in a sense. Media support is most important, I think, here. And we see that why the far right are actually even sometimes asking for this media support is because in their own societies they are denied this media visibility that Russia can give them. The far right is considered mostly as this, anti-establishment, populist, and in general bad thing in European liberal democracies. So the mainstream media are obviously quite negatively. The approach of the mainstream media is quite critical and negative towards the far right. Russia does not care about this, and it is ready through its media channels, RT, Sputnik, some other channels. They are ready to amplify the messages of the far right. Then we have, of course, political support. And by political support, I mean, sometimes the visibility or political visibility that is given to particular candidates. So one example would be 2017 and the presidential elections in France, where we saw that Marine Le Pen, second most popular candidate in those presidential elections, she visited Moscow in March 2017, and she met with Vladimir Putin just 1 month before the first round of the presidential elections. And of course, Putin denied that that was some sort of interference in the elections, or that Marine Le Pen was their preferred candidate. It was the message was very, very clear. Marine Le Pen was the candidate of the Kremlin. And that was obviously in the opposition to Emmanuel Macron. However, this political support, or with this political support, the Kremlin is actually quite cautious. And I would say that it is being very pragmatic in the sense of, for example, before, again, if we look at the 2017, so even before Macron's rise in popularity, Russia was not willing to give any support to Marine Le Pen, because the Kremlin's bet was on François Fillon. So there was this, political pragmatism is very important here. And also, you may know that with the French case with Marine Le Pen, we also have this most prominent case of financial support, 9 million euros given to the National Front, when it was still called the National Front, in 2014 for the regional elections in 2015 in France. It was a bank loan, which the party still has to repay to Russia, to one Russian company. I want to get back to my characterization of Russia as right-wing authoritarian kleptocracy. And already here, we have this dual nature of Russia. And there's also this dual nature of the support that Russian actors affiliated with the Kremlin are giving to the European far right. So on the one hand, I would say that there is an ideological aspect to it. Because although in some cases we see that Russia or Russian actors, they are quite favorable towards the far left, still they actually prefer to cooperate with the far right. And however, to this ideological aspect, we have a different aspect, which is totally pragmatic. So yes, Russia is right-wing authoritarian, but it's also kleptocratic, which means that it is being actually very cynical, and they would be happy to cooperate with anyone in the West who is promoting or advancing the Kremlin's foreign policy interests. However, and one of the reasons why in 2012, 2013, Russia started gradually turning to the far right is because the number of people in the mainstream, in the European or Western mainstream, who would be ready to promote or advance Russian foreign policy interests, it started to shrink. Not many people in the mainstream politics are ready to whitewash, well, the annexation of Crimea, for example, or the war in the Donbass. So this number of so-called Putin-Versteher, those understanders of Putin who are actually just justifying what the Kremlin is doing, it is, in comparison, 2011, 2010, it's now quite small. There are still people in the mainstream, and of course, probably they are much more important for the Kremlin than those far-right groups and far-right political parties. I would say that Gerhard Schröder, former Chancellor of Germany, is worth several Marine Le Pens. Because Marine Le Pen, although she is quite popular, she probably will be again in the second round of presidential elections, but Gerhard Schröder's own power, his own influence on Germany and on German establishment, although it is quite small, I mean, but it is much, much larger and much more important than the influence of Marine Le Pen. So with this cooperation with the far right on the part of the Kremlin, we always have this dual nature. Yes, cooperating with the far right, but if possible, it would be much more interesting and much better, much more useful for the Kremlin to corrupt mainstream politicians who have more power and who are much more significant. And I will stop here and once again congratulate Marlene on this very, very important book.
Okay, thank you, Anton, and thanks to all the discussants. Some really great points that I think will serve to frame the rest of the discussion very nicely. So before opening up things to questions and answers, we've already got a number of those, so I encourage you to keep the questions and comments coming. But let's first give Marlene a chance to respond to what has been said, and then we'll turn to the questions.
Right. Thank you so much for all your comments. It's of course very helpful, and I'm happy we're having this discussion. And many issues you mentioned, I was myself kind of in difficulties with them in writing the books. Let me just make kind of two short comments. Paul, on the kind of informal power relation part missing, I totally agree. In fact, I had it and then I had to withdraw it, the chapter from the book because it was too long. But you know, that's one of my forthcoming projects. It's on this outsourcing mechanism. So ideologies are the market where you can see both top-down and bottom-up processes that meet very often around financial goals, right? That how you can get a grant from the presidential administration to promote this or that. So I agree, maybe I should have developed that aspect more in the book. And Anton, on your comment on the Russian regime being right-wing, my problem with the term right-wing is that it's not a problem to be right-wing, right? It's totally legitimate in the political landscape to be right-wing. I mean, German Christian Democrats are right-wing, the Republican Party in the US is right-wing. So once you say that, I mean, you add autocracy and kleptocracy, which, I mean, authoritarian and kleptocracy after. But for me, the terminology of illiberal make more sense than right-wing, because it shows that it's not the classic mainstream right-wing as we can have it in Europe or in the US. It's something specifically targeting, it's a right-wing targeting political liberalism, which is not the tradition in a classic kind of mainstream right-wing. So I prefer to use illiberalism, that right-wing. But I totally agree that Russia would prefer to work with mainstream actors because they would be more influential than far-right. And I totally agree with Russia being very cynical. And I think the key moment of this cynicism in terms of ideological production is that if you look at what Russia Today, RT and Sputnik are telling European audience about Islam, migrants, and so on, and when you see the Russian narrative domestically about Islam, which is much more positive, Islam is promoted as a kind of positive element of Russia's statehood, I think that's a key example showing the cynical aspect. But now back on what I think was both Paul and Yoshiko key issues about this ethno-nationalism, patriotism aspect. For me, what is happening around patriotism is much more concerning in terms of militarization of the youth than it is in terms of promoting ethnic nationalism. And the fieldwork I did among these kind of young military patriotic groups was at first it's mostly about loyalty toward the regime around the kind of usual consensual myth, the Second World War, form of anti-Westernism. Nationalism or ethno-nationalism is very kind of limited. And on the field, these people are mostly, you know, like helping socially disadvantaged groups, right? So it's mostly providing this kind of support to a kind of capture audience. Because if you are part of the urban middle classes, you don't need to participate in this kind of military upbringing, right? It's not interesting for you, you can avoid it. So it's really kind of keeping this socially disadvantaged group kind of loyal to the regime by providing this kind of activities on the side. But more globally on this ethno-nationalism aspect, well, I don't see Russia's policy in the near abroad being very much focused on ethno-nationalism, except in the case of Crimea, and still it was only one element about a broader portfolio of justification. In Central Asia, I don't see ethno-nationalism. I mean, Russia doesn't care about the status of the Russian minority. Russia cares about Russian minority only when it can use them as a tool to coerce an unfriendly regime, right? So the Baltic state, Ukraine, but otherwise Russia doesn't care about its ethnic compatriot abroad. Second, I don't see where it's imperialism when you have a policy of bringing these so-called compatriot back. I mean, if really Russia wanted to kind of activate them, they would kind of helping them staying at home and activate them. I think very often Russia just cares about them coming back also because it has this kind of feeling of demographic collapse. What Russia is doing in Central Asia, well, it's accommodating pretty well China, and it's realizing that it's progressively losing ground of controlling Central Asia, except at the strategic level. And I think they are fine with that because they know they don't have any other choice. So I don't really see ethno-nationalism as a key feature, and except the few moments in 2014 when it was very much pushed by the regime, the kind of solidarity with ethnic abroad because of Crimea. Otherwise, the regime is not really promoting them. I mean, and you can see how, on the contrary, at for the domestic audience, they really care about maintaining this kind of multi-ethnicity narrative. They very much talk to their Muslim population because the regimes need support from ethnic republics. They are still the most loyal to the regime, much more than kind of ethnic Russian urban middle classes. And I think even when you look at the 2020 July constitutional amendment, you can see how they try to, yes, give the floor to those who would like more ethno-nationalism references to Ruskiye, and at the same time trying to kind of avoid making that too official. And my last point is about I think one of the solutions of the regime to avoid moving toward ethno-nationalism, because they know it would be dangerous for the stability of the country, is to promote conservative values. Because once you frame things as conservative values, then you speak to your Muslim leadership easily, right? You can promote the Russian Orthodox Church without having the Muslim institution unhappy because they know that they are second in line in being promoted, and that everything that the Russian Orthodox Church is gaining, then Muslim Islamic institution will be gaining at their local level. So I think that's the way I interpret this kind of tension that the regime is having with nationalism, is always trying to move toward ethno-nationalism and keeping the broader consensus possible. And so it's patriotism, this kind of sacralizing the memory of the Second World War, and the traditional value that everybody can interpret as they want. So that was kind of my answer to some of your comments, but I'm happy to see that it needs kind of more work to be really kind of discussed in a more in-depth aspect. I will stop here and give the floor back to Henry.
Okay. So we have a lot of questions. Maybe I'll first pose a set that are kind of together in questioning whether you think, even if adequate to characterize it as a lighter form of fascism, something more like, light, like, Mussolini, right? Maybe not Hitler, but Mussolini. So some of the things that people put up in this line have to do with, references to Navalny and imprisoning people for their political beliefs, powerful propaganda machines, the victimization, memory wars that the regime promotes on World War II, increased efforts to control media, internet, the glorification of Putin, mobilization of youth organizations, which you discussed a minute ago. Giovanna Di Maio also mentioned, kind of emphasized Paul's remark on patriotic education, in particular, kind of fascist style. How do you see like that with respect to the fascist style leadership and indoctrination? So those are a bunch of kind of related things. So let's start off maybe with asking for you to respond to that.
Yeah. So on all these kind of possible categorization, so sending people and political opponents in jail is not a specificity of a fascist regime. I think that's one of the key issues, that you have so many ways of not being a liberal democracy. Right? There are many other ways of that don't qualify for the terminology of fascism. An authoritarian regime will send people to jail. That doesn't make it a fascist. And if you compare with many other authoritarian countries, I think Russia is still managing pretty well. It's kind of very targeted repression if you compare to, I don't know, even Erdogan, Turkey after the coup, or even not comparing with China. I think Russia managed to have this kind of very targeted repression towards some segment of the population and trying to avoid mass repression. And so far they have pretty well succeeded. The propaganda media aspect, I think it's key in maintaining the consensus around the regime. But here also, I don't think it's reaching this kind of totalitarian level that would qualify for being a fascist regime, that it's controlling mass media to be sure everybody is in line, more or less, at least in public statement. Yes, but if you want to disagree, you can disagree, you can still read alternative media, you can refuse to be politicized and political. And we see that in survey that the Russian public opinion is still on many aspects in disagreement or far away from what the regime would like it to be. So I think on that, Russia, as many of this liberal regime, is hoping to get a kind of, they are afraid of plurality of opinion. That doesn't make them fascist. I think that's a tendency that you have in many of our societies. And I think many tools that we are identifying as being kind of propaganda tool developed by Russian media, I'm sorry, but they are marketing tools that are also developed by privatized media in our Western society. So it's more about marketing than it is purely about kind of propaganda. The mobilization of the youth, or globally the mobilization of the population, well, I see two key moments where Russia, the regimes, was really in a mobilizing strategy. One is around the Nashi after the 2004 Orange Revolution, and then they stopped the movement. And the second one was the few months of the 2014, really at the peak of the crisis, where the regime was there mobilizing the population, and then after kind of closed that box because I think they realized it was potentially dangerous for the regime itself. Otherwise, I don't think the regime is interested in mobilizing the population. The regime is interested at not politicizing the population in a way that would go against the regimes. And the case of Armia and all this kind of youth patriotism, as I was saying, I think, and I have that in the discussion on this kind of tradition of paramilitary, I think that the only moment where inside the regimes, you have groups that have this kind of dream of having a kind of avant-garde youth movement that would be ideologically very radical. But at the same time, when you look in details on how these UNARMIA projects are working, it's managed by the Ministry of Defense. It's usually all kind of Soviet tropes of bringing, indoctrinating the population. And I was saying it's mostly serving socially disadvantaged groups. So here I see, yeah, I think around this militarization of the society, that's where you have this kind of element where the regime partly qualify. But I think it's just one small aspect of everything that the Russian regime is trying to co-opt the society, and you have much broader things than that. I mean, if you look at, I don't know, how they co-opt celebrity and musician and actors in promoting, you know, visual and musical kind of feeling of shared identity with the population. All these aspects, they are also very important. So I think it's always a question of how do we balance everything that the regime is providing, and what if we tend to kind of have an amplifying lens on only one aspect, and we forgot to look at the broad spectrum of tools with whom the regime is trying to discuss with the society.
Okay, terrific. So maybe continuing on a little bit, the theme of, you know, kind of whether or not Russia might meet certain criteria. Andreas Umland, also a renowned expert on this topic, questions whether or not we can really talk about something like the absolute absence of concentration camps. You know, so he cites an OCHCR report on occupied Donbass and torture prisons discovered there. And so if we kind of think about, you know, sort of what he calls sub-regimes in, you know, the DNR, the LNR, and in Eastern Ukraine now, you know, like what implications does that have? I mean, do these start to kind of meet that definition? How do you respond?
Yeah, so I'm not using the kind of concentration camp argument. I think what is happening, I mean, this concentration camp in the Donbass secessionist regime, well, first it's a war context, so I think it changed a lot compared to a non-war context. And then I think, yes, Russia is allowing the regimes the sub-regime that is supporting to be more violent than it would be toward its own population. It can be the Donbass region, it can be Syria. Honestly, here also, I don't see how that would qualify for fascism. I think that the US is supporting a lot of regimes in the world for strategic reasons that are known for their violation of human rights. I mean, Saudi Arabia being one, but there are many others. When we are in wartime, it's even worse. So I think it's part of a strategic agenda. So if you want to say that the regime has kind of no, you know, feeling of no kind of bad feeling of supporting regime that can be bloody when they are fulfilling some strategic goals, yet I think that's what Russia is doing. I think that's what many great power in the world are doing. So for me, it's more kind of on the strategic level than it is on any kind of ideological aspect.
Okay, maybe let's shift focus a little bit. There are a few questions on, you know, basically along the theme of, you know, does this matter? Why does this matter? So, you know, David Kramer starts off the question about, you know, from a policy perspective, he asks, what does it matter whether one calls Putin's regime, you know, as distinct maybe from Russia, as a country, fascist or not? It's still an existential threat based on its actions towards its own people, its neighbors, and to the West. And so, you know, he asks, while rejecting the fascist label, you know, do you still view the Putin regime as a threat? There are a couple other questions along similar lines, like, you know, does this, whether Russia is fascist, really matter for the post-Putin era? Is this just kind of a limited
Henry, I had issues hearing you for the last questions.
And there's also a question the questioner calls the, okay.
Can you repeat the second series of questions? I had the policy perspective
Okay.
one.
Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, does it matter for the post-Putin era, right? Is your analysis really kind of, focused on kind of Putin, or, what does this matter for what's to come? And there's also the question of what should be done to help Russia. Does your book have any implications for what might be done to help Russia, given its regime and what the questioner calls the abusive regime?
Yeah, thank you. So on the policy perspective, and does it matter how we call it? Well, I think it does matter, because when you call a regime fascist, you are pushing it in such kind of delegitimizing framework that it's implied that you don't have to discuss with it, right? If Putin is Hitler, then you don't have to discuss with Putin. And you don't have to discuss to kind of build a dialogue with Russia. You don't have to need to have Russians in some of, I don't know, instances of cooperation. So I think it's a label that push for excluding Russia or whoever is called the fascist regime from the international scene. So I think it has a policy perspective. On Russia being an existential threat to the West, I don't share that view. I think existential threat is too strong. I think the liberal democracy, if they are under existential threat, it's because of what is happening in their own countries, and the solution have to be found in our own countries. And foreign influence, it's only acting at the margin of these existential issues that liberal democracy are facing. So that's what I was saying in my presentation. I don't think it's, at least I'm not sharing the view that there is this kind of ontological division between, on one side, liberal democracy, and on the other side, the Putin's regime, whatever we want to call it. I think it's much more complex. It's much more about interaction, and it's much more about looking at our own society as also producing threat to liberal democracy that don't need to have Russia around. I think liberal democracy is indeed threatened, but by things that are happening in our own country. And I would just mention one aspect, is that the literal kind of hysteria about Russian media interference, well, regulates the way Facebook and Google are managing their business mechanisms and their algorithm. You would have already solved a lot. And that is happening inside our own society and inside especially American society. The post-Putin issue, I think, well, you can always have, and I think the regime is in fact playing on that, this idea that, well, after Putin, you could have a more radical figure arriving in power and potentially have someone that would qualify for the fascism title more visibly. At the same time, when you look at survey and what is happening in the Russian society, I would be much more optimistic and much more cautious about the risk of the regime becoming worse. I think the Russian society is showing a lot of interesting activism and kind of plurality of opinion on many aspects. The younger generation, which is not so young anymore now, is very different from many of the tools that the regime can use to get the support of the population. So I think we will see more plurality arriving in Russia in the forthcoming year, more than having a kind of Zhirinovsky type of leader arriving after Putin. And then what can be done to help Russia? Well, I didn't tackle these kind of issues because I'm not a policy practitioner, so I didn't come up with a set of things, and it's not the way I would think about the question, because wanting to help Russia, that means you have to define who you want to help and toward which goals, and that's not what I was looking at. And then
Okay,
I
great.
see, sorry, I see David Kramer commenting, if you were Ukrainian, Georgian, Syrian, would you consider is that as a threat? Well, yeah, for Ukraine and for Georgia, I think Russia is a threat. That doesn't mean that it's the threat. It's an existential threat for all liberal democracy. For Syria, I'm not sure. For Syria, I think it depends who you are in Syria to see it as a threat. For many people, the Islamic State was more of a threat than having Russia defending a criminal regime like Bashar al-Assad. So I think for Syria, it's more complicated.
Okay, great. There are also a couple questions related to certain themes that your book touches on. One of them is the role of religion. One commenter notes that German fascism was anti-religious. Talks about today's Russia as being closely, Russia's regime being closely tied to orthodoxy. So what role does religion play in your book's analysis? And there's a related question about connections between far-right actors in the US and Putin's regime and the Russian Orthodox Church. So, the question is about what influence do you think the American far-right religio-political imaginary has on how Russia is perceived in the international community? There are a couple other questions too, maybe I'll just stick in kind of as this kind of translates into implications about how we understand Western societies. There's a question about, when speaking of fascism in Russia and the West, do you think the West is to a large extent trying to dodge the issue of the rise of the far-right movements in its own societies? And there's also a question about the extent to which your focus on fascism as a discourse can help us make sense of the fascism surrounding Trump. So I think some of that was sort of touched on in the discussion. Maybe on what's been said to comment, and then we can come back. There are a few more questions. If people can be brief, we need to be brief. Yeah. All right, Marlene, go ahead.
Yeah, on the role of religion, that's a good question. I think the regime needs the church in trying to bring this traditional value, conservative value narrative to be shared by the population. At the same time, the church needs the state to get its status kind of confirmed or institutionalized. So it's a kind of mutual axis of convenience. At the same time, I think many inside the Russian establishment are also very careful about protecting the secularity of some institutions. So the church is also getting refused a lot of its claim when they are considered too much intrusive, but the church has very strong lobby, especially now inside the Russian establishment, especially around everything related. I would say that like abortion is once again becoming one of the frontline issues. Everything that is related to LGBT rights is already largely negatively assessed by the population. So in a sense, it's an easy consensus for the regime. But the next fight for the church is probably the abortion, and that will be resisted by a large part of the Russian establishment and of the society. I think the key issue where they disagree, in fact, is in this memory issue. The church is much more critical of the Soviet past than the Russian regime is. And as I have been looking at the way the memory of Stalinism repression is now developed or discussed in Russia, my impression is that the church is finally kind of getting control of this memory of Stalinist repression as the way that allowed the regime to both saying that, well, Stalinist repression were problematic and we should mourn the victim. At the same time, we shouldn't judge the regime. And of course, we shouldn't make any parallel between Stalinist repression and the Putin's regime. And on that, the church has been a very key memory actor to help the regime maintaining this kind of balance. On the connection between US far right and Russia, well, the real connection, and Anton knows that better than me, the real connection between US far right individuals and Russian far right individuals, they exist, but they are quite limited. What I think is a bigger issue is the connection between some aspect of the Christian right and the Russian Orthodox Church or the Russian establishment. And so around some figure of the Christian right, some institution like the National Prayer Breakfast, the NRA, you had a kind of Russian lobbyism very active a few years ago, and of course the Trump presidency, so these links are there. At the same time, I think it's very difficult for the Christian rights to develop a narrative that would be positive on Russia at the geopolitical level, right? So they can be positive about the Putin's regime defending traditional values, and you have this mythology around the US far right about Russia as being a pure, ethnically pure white country and proud of its Christian identity and whiteness. But I think it's much more difficult, in fact, to articulate geopolitically, just because the Christian right need also to speak to a majority of Republican voters for whom Russia is more an enemy than a partner. And then on the question of Western society, yeah, I think that's we are labeling Russia as fascist as a way to avoid discussing what is happening in our own society. And as I was saying, I think the threat of illiberalism, populism is homegrown, it's grassroots in Europe, and Russia plays a role in giving it the floor, but the solution should be found on the ground in what is happening in our society, and not only by kind of fighting this amplifier role that Russia is playing. And that I missed, Henry, your last question. I couldn't hear the sound.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it was basically along those lines. You know, to what extent can your focus on fascism as a discourse help us make sense of the fascism debate in the U.S. surrounding Trump?
Yeah, I think that's
and other parallels between that debate with the Russian.
Yeah, I think that's really the key issue, is that we tend to interpret a liberal leader as fascist, and that's what happened around Trump. And I think that's a mislabeling, and that's a misinterpretation. And so if we label him as fascist, we lose the ability to understand popular support, to identify constituencies for whom some aspect of that narrative makes sense. We lose the ability to look at politics as being not necessarily something that would fit any kind of rational framework. It's about emotion, it's about language, it's about body language. And so if we lose all this kind of flesh of what makes people voting for someone or another, we lose also the ability to fight against this illiberal wave. So I think it's really important to accept that illiberalism is part of our liberal democracies, and that's homegrown, and the solution has to be found by discussing with this electorate, and not by kind of polarizing it, by presenting it as a kind of absolute evil.
Okay, I wish we had a whole day to discuss this, but maybe let's give, if the discussants want to, you know, totally up to you, if you want to kind of add a minute or two worth of comments at this point, we can hear those and then go to a few more questions. So Paul?
I don't have a whole lot to add, really. I think so much ground has been covered already, and obviously the book covers in much greater detail and nuance than we can possibly manage in an hour and a half session. I just wanted to mention there was one passage that I triple highlighted and starred just because I thought it really rang true. And it's one of the reasons why I agree that Russia is not a fascist regime. And that's, you know, when this is towards the end of the book, where it's written, Moscow's standard of normalcy is the Cold War, not the Molotov-Ribbentrop era. And that the Kremlin does not live in an ideological world inspired by Nazi Germany, but rather a world in which the perestroika years, the collapse of the Yalta Order, the breakup of the Soviet Union still constitute the main historical reference and traumas. And I think this is absolutely key for understanding what is the nature of the regime, what is the ideological valence. There are competing ideologies, obviously. I think there is room for discussion about, you know, whether or not those boundaries between what is fascism and what isn't fascism are movable. And more importantly, to think about the mechanisms by which they move. And I think that's exactly the position that this book forces us to address. And I think that does a tremendous service for the field. So I just can't recommend this book highly enough.
Thank you. Yoshiko.
Yeah, thanks. I also wish we had more time, but I just want to emphasize, I guess, that one, from the chat comments, I think there is a value in asking and answering the question of whether Russia or other countries are fascist, of asking and answer whether Trump is fascist, because that's what we do in political science. We analyze concepts. So I think, okay, that might not be everybody's cup of tea, but that is one of the issues of scholarly inquiry, is that we analyze concepts. So I wanted to emphasize that. But the other thing is that just because we say Putin or Trump, Putin's Russia today is not fascist, I really want to emphasize that doesn't mean it doesn't use violence, that it's not a morally objectionable regime. I mean, just look at what's happening with Navalny right now in prison. So the regime, I think, is increasingly using violence. And it is a threat in the sense of having conflicting goals with other regimes. So yeah, I mean, it's not a cooperative partner to many, if not all, democracies in the world right now. So I guess I just want to emphasize, if you don't call somebody or some place or some country fascist, it doesn't mean you absolve them of all the problems that they have. And so I think we have to consider, like, it is a regime that's using violence. It is not a democracy. It's authoritarian. It's illiberal in the way that Marlene argues. And it remains a real problem for many people within Russia, as well as in terms of other countries, even if we are not calling it a fascist regime.
Okay, thank you. Anton.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to this thesis about concentration camps, and obviously we essentially when we call somebody a fascist, sometimes in most cases we have so much emotion in this terminology, because obviously after the Second World War, fascism became to be associated, or became even a word for ultimate evil. Yeah. However, even if we look at some of the practices like concentration camps, well, concentration camps, they did not appear first in the Third Reich, and not even in the Soviet Union. They appeared first, I think the Brits or the Spaniards used them. And on the one hand, today we have concentration camps in China for the Uyghur Muslim minority, but nobody will think of labeling China as fascist. It is a communist regime. So these practices, if they are not an an authentic ideological element, or if they don't correspond to this ideological element, we cannot say that these characteristics are, necessarily fascist. So, yeah.
Okay, we have some more questions. So maybe I'll pose first one from Güzel Yusupova, who basically asks you to elaborate a little more on the role of ethno-nationalism. And I think kind of the key part of her question is, she writes that it seems that public perception of any claims of both indigenous minorities or immigrants in Russia are considered a danger to social security. And so why doesn't that relate to ethno-nationalism in your opinion? So maybe if you could comment on the role of ethno-nationalism.
Yeah, I didn't see the question written, so I'm not sure I capture it right. I think the regime is afraid of plurality of opinion and need a kind of hegemonical consensus, because it feels that the only way the regimes can be secured and the country rescued from another collapse, right? Because the regime and the country are associated on the way the regime is thinking of its own security. So I think that what they are both afraid of Russian ethno-nationalist group that would become too kind of revolutionary and polarizing in fracturing the society, as they are afraid of minority ethno-nationalism that is also considered as a danger. So they see that danger on both sides, from the minority and from the so-called ethnic Russian. And so the solution, I think, is to both offer plurality of narrative. So if you are in favor of Russian ethno-nationalism, you can find small things to eat in what is the ideological production of the regime. You can find small elements that hopefully will make you happy. But if you are very much against this kind of ethno-nationalism and you have this kind of more traditional, almost Eurasianist narrative about Russia being a kind of community of destiny of different people of different regions, you will also find that. It's also offered by the regime in a lot of its public statements, in a lot of its written statements. So it's offering a little bit of everything to everyone in order to try to keep this consensus. But as I was saying, I think the way the regime is trying to avoid ethno-nationalism on one way or another is to have this broad framework of conservatism and traditional value, where they hope that both the kind of radical ethno-nationalist Russian, close to the Russian Orthodox Church, will feel happy, and at the same time, the kind of more conservative Muslim population will also find it's happy. So in fact, it's trying to move away from ethnicity and promote something that looks like religious. Because if you push for something that is more religious, you can see the Russian Orthodox Church and the Islamic institution working together and not competing with each other. So I think that's one of their strategy of trying to avoid this kind of polarization of around ethno-nationalism, because I think they are very much aware that that would contribute to fracture the country. I don't know if I really answer the question.
Yeah, I think that'll be a question for important future discussion. I have two unanswered questions, and they both kind of relate to the theme about Russian politics today. And so maybe if you could just take those at the end here, which is what distinguishes Putin from a 19th century Czar? And the second question is basically that you and Professor Herrera mentioned Putin is very past focused. So the question is, Putin is so past focused, it seems he has no plans or vision for the future. Is this just a feature of Putinism, or is it something related to a Russian national psyche? So I think it's just a comment on that, that comment on Putin. So maybe we can wrap it up with that.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't make the parallel between Putin and a Tsar, I mean, except as a kind of metaphor, but I think in practice, the Russian regime today, its administration, the way it's functioning, its technocracy, and its kind of all these informal aspects that Paul was mentioning are very far away from what Tsarism was. I think the second question is an interesting one, because it's not because you are past focused that you don't have any plan. It's more complicated than not having a plan. The plan is to not have a plan. And that's a plan by design, not by default. I think the regime is very much aware that they need strategic fluidity and they need ideological fluidity. That's the only way for them to survive, to adapt, to respond to the population kind of shift of opinion and feeling, but also to take advantage of the fact that, as I'm often saying, Russia is a poor great power. When you are poor great power, you need to match your ambition with the realities of what you have on the ground. And for that, you need to be innovative, creative, kind of postmodern, eclectic. And I think the strategic fluidity is a plan in a way, and I think it has been working pretty well for the regime so far. One day or another it will stop working, but it has been working for very long to have this kind of improvisation mechanism that has helped the regime changing and adapting to evolving context.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our period. So let me first thank our discussants for great comments. And of course, most of all, thank Marlene for contributing an amazing new book that I'm sure will get a lot of attention and become a landmark work in the field. So congratulations again. And I think this will just be one of the first of many more discussions about this and related themes that we all have together. So thanks to everyone for joining us. And I hope people get the chance to enjoy some good spring weather sometime soon.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.